Welcome everyone to Schmoozic. I am Trisha Panzer, Board Chair of the Executive Committee of the American Friends of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. I am thrilled to welcome you all this morning. We are so grateful for your support and participation in our programs, and we look forward to doing more digital events like this one today throughout the summer and fall. This program was made possible in part by Aspiration, a financial services company that is partnering with the Israel Philharmonic to reduce the orchestra's carbon footprint and donating instruments to the Israel Philharmonic's music education programs, as you just saw. To learn more, please visit partners.afipo.org. I am delighted to be here today with my friend, Daniel Libeskind. I want to take a moment to wish Daniel a very happy belated 75th birthday, which he celebrated many times earlier this month.
Thank you.
Of course. Daniel is a Polish-American architect and an international figure in architecture and urban design. Informed by deep commitment to music, philosophy, and literature, Daniel aims to create architecture that is resonant, original, and sustainable. He established his architectural studio in Berlin, Germany in 1989 after winning the competition to build the Jewish Museum in Berlin. In February 2003, Studio Libeskind moved its headquarters from Berlin to New York City to oversee the master plans for the World Trade Center redevelopment, which is being realized in Lower Manhattan today. Daniel's practice is involved in designing and realizing a diverse array of urban, cultural, and commercial projects around the globe. The studio has completed buildings that range from museums and concert halls to convention centers, university buildings, hotels, shopping centers, and residential towers. As principal design architect for Studio Libeskind, Daniel speaks widely on the art of architecture in universities and at professional summits. His architecture and ideas have been the subject of many articles and exhibitions, influencing the field of architecture and the development of cities and culture. Daniel is a very close friend of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. His wife, Nina, sits on the board of the American Friends, and they have been lifelong supporters and audience members. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much. How great to be here and to speak about the beauty of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra and the importance of it. Being, an orchestra that is, ecumenical, has everybody as part of it and contributes so much to the life, not just of Israel, but of the world.
Absolutely. We always consider the orchestra to be Israel's ambassador around the world.
Totally.
And we appreciate your support. We want to hear about your career and how you began. We know that your career actually began as a virtuoso accordion player in Poland, and you even performed with Itzhak Perlman. So we wonder, did you ever think that one day you might become a professional musician?
Well, that's a great question. I played the accordion from a very young age. And for those in the audience who might be sort of a little surprised, why the accordion? The answer is pretty simple and also pretty interesting. I grew up in Poland. My parents were survivors of the Holocaust. And of course, the anti-Semitism in Poland was so powerful that my parents were too afraid to bring the piano to the courtyard, because of their neighbors. So they brought me a hidden piano, which is a piano inside of a suitcase, which happens to be the accordion. And I remember at the age of 6 when because I wanted to play the piano, I was pretty perplexed because it looked a little bit like the piano, but not quite, because it had the bellows and the buttons and so on. But, that was my destiny. My destiny was therefore to play on an instrument that was a kind of substitute piano. And of course, I became very good at it. I became a virtuoso. In fact, I performed on the first sort of broadcast of the Polish television on this instrument. And I played in orchestras with, much older accordionists as well. And then when I came to Israel, I was told I should compete in the America-Israel, competition for music, which was bizarre because everybody was there with a violin, cello, piano, voice, clarinet, and when I walked into that room in which we had, Isaac Stern, Zeno Francescatti, and Mrs. Kusevitsky, they thought, what is this man doing? Because I came with my father, was I couldn't even carry the accordion. It was too heavy. So my father had to enter the room with a suitcase, and I opened it and strapped it, and they looked at me like, what the hell is this person doing? But I have to tell you, when the first 4 chords of the Bach's Toccata in D minor, which I played, they stopped smiling. And when I finished, I was one of the few winners. The other winner was Isaac Perelman. There were only about 5 winners. There were not hundreds of winners. And so Isaac Stern came over to me, of course, put his hand around me and said, you already have, done everything on this instrument. There's nothing more for you to do on this. You must play the piano. But, saying it to a young person, it's quite difficult to go from the vertical keyboard to the horizontal. That's probably why I became an architect, because architecture is vertical. It's not horizontal. Right. So anyway, that was my destiny. My destiny was playing an instrument that brought me to architecture.
And how did you make that transition from the music world to architecture? And I know music still stays with you a lot in the work that you do and in your thoughts. How does that happen? And you were just telling me actually also about a project you're doing that combines both of your interests in music and architecture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, I tried to find, I didn't know really what architects did. I grew up in a very working class environment in the, when we came to America in the Bronx, and I didn't know any real professionals. I didn't even know what architects did. But my interests drifted towards something like music. What is music? I love music, and I love music. And drawing. I love to draw. And imagination, making something with your hands, creating something like a sculpture. And somehow, and of course, because I went to the Bronx High School of Science, in the time of the Cold War, I was placed in the sort of competitive class to catch up with the Russians in space technology. So I loved mathematics and physics and the sciences. And so all these interests, mathematics, geometry, physics, music, painting, of course, love of history, love of literature, somehow, I don't know how, but luckily for me, I wound up in architecture, which seems to combine all these things because it's about human life. It's about people living together. And that's really all those fields brought together. And of course, to answer the second part of your question, many of my works deal both implicitly, explicitly with music. First of all, explicitly, because architecture has to take account of acoustics. Acoustics are our orientation in space. We are not oriented by our eyes, but by our ears. So our sense of balance has to do with music. And of course, imaginatively, I also treat architecture drawings and architecture planning like a musical score, which is performed, of course, by many people, like an orchestra, to create something that is really a communal experience. It's not a private experience of the person who does it. It's really for the community itself. So really, in many ways, music is the guiding muse of my life.
That's very fascinating. I'm interested to know, I know that your parents were Holocaust survivors and you yourself are an immigrant to this country. Speaking of the emotion that comes from music and that is in much of your architecture, how do you think that your own personal history had an effect on your career and how you approach your designs?
Well, completely, because I grew up in a kind of dark time on the communist totalitarian system, which was also fully anti-Semitic, I understood from very early on, and my parents, who were proud Jews, they were not, assimilated Jews. They were not sort of hiding themselves. They were proud. They spoke Yiddish on the streets. They were Jewish in the deepest way. it taught me something, that the most important thing is to maintain the idea of freedom, of who you are, even in very adverse circumstances. And then, of course, I had the chance in many of my projects to confront what is architecture. Architecture is not just making a nice building with nice windows and nice doors. It's really about society. It's about how we fit in together. How can we be tolerant? How can we create something that unites us and does not divide us? So yes, that's been a very powerful, my background really, my Jewishness and everything that I am has a lot to do with how I approach architecture, which is always with hope, always with a future in mind, knowing that the past is irreversible, but the future is open to us and we can make it much better than it is by working with other people.
Yes, which is evident in many of the projects that you've worked on that carry a lot of motion with them, such as the World Trade Center.
Well, recently I've won a competition to design the Tree of Life Synagogue, and all the facilities, how to transform this place, which was really so devastated by killings of Jews who were at prayer. And how do we respond in a society which has so much bigotry, hatred, anti-Semitism, racism? How does architecture become part of a story that gives us inspiration and creates something of a space of security and of pleasure and of joy and of hope? That's something that I think every project, of course, not every project is as dramatic as the project that I often dealt with, but every project needs to be addressed in a sense of the tradition, the hope, and of course, architecture is about joy. It's despite all the things that it has to deal with, it's about bringing something beautiful to people's lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. Looking back, your first big commission was the Berlin Museum?
Yes, not big commission. It was my very first building. I never even designed a small building, because even though I was trained as an architect, I tried to work for some famous architects. I didn't last more than a few hours here and there. I thought it was just too boring for me. It's not going to be what I want to do. And somehow I chose a strange path, which is path that most people thought, okay, he's never going to do architecture. He's just going to sit and draw and read books and teach and do all these things. But I had an idea that architecture has different, there are different ways to access architecture. And of course, I was lucky to win the competition. By the way, it's lucky to win a competition, but it's much more difficult to build a building, because I won the competition. It was not even called the Jewish Museum, by the way. My project made it into a Jewish museum. The competition was for a Berlin museum in Berlin with a, what they call the department, Jewish department. But, everything in me revolted against that idea. Jews cannot be departmentalized. Jews were part of German history. They were not just victims. They were also, the Albert Einstein, the Schoenbergs, the great, Rachel Varnhagen, the great Jewish philosophers and the working people that made Germany so successful were Jews. So I did everything in my power to steer the museum away from this idea of the Berlin Museum to create a Jewish museum. Of course, it wasn't easy to build it. It took many, many years politically. People were, very skeptical that such a project should ever be built. But to be a believer, and I am. So it was built.
Well, we're very thrilled that project got done. And I was reading a little bit about it, that the museum has a floor plan that resembles the Star of David.
Yes, well, it is actually. The museum is based on a really a Star of David that really radiates across the city of Berlin, east and west, north and south. It's not just in the building itself. It's really sort of radiating outwards, and it's brought together into the center of this museum, which also has a void across it, as a kind of emptiness, an abyss, which talks about that which cannot be retrieved, which is the genocide perpetrated from Berlin and from Germany against the Jewish people. But at the same time, it opens, hopeful new things in the museum: gardens, a story of the future, story of light, story of things we don't see anymore, but we should see and be aware of, and story of the importance of how people look at their past in order to create a future that is meaningful and that is positive.
I hope myself to be able to visit one day. I really do. Do you think that I've seen some people describe your work as deconstructivist, characterized by fragmentation, asymmetry, and angularity. Is that how you would describe your work? Do you think you have a particular aesthetic or style?
No, I wouldn't describe it like that at all. I mean, this comes from a sort of an academic idea and from an exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art called the Deconstructivist Architecture, in which I was prominently featured. But really, it's the wrong definition. Architecture is not about angles, and it's not about fragments. It's not about asymmetries. It's really about creating space through light, through form, through character, through sound, through proportions, through materials, through sustainable ideas. So it's kind of a primitive definition. I wouldn't subscribe to it at all. But of course, there was a sort of deconstructivism was a word like existentialism was in the 50s that combined everything was going in the, everybody was an existentialist in the 50s and 60s, right? Because it was kind of a general world to describe people interested in their time. And of course, deconstructivism was that kind of a word in the 80s and the 90s and even today that describes sort of moving away from nostalgic older notions and confronting the world we see today. But certainly it's not a style as far as I'm concerned. And the words you use, certainly I would not subscribe to it. I do plenty of buildings that are symmetrical, that are not angular, that are curvilinear, that have harmonies that are, of course, different from traditional buildings, but still very much part of classical tradition in architecture.
So when you first started with the Berlin Museum, the approach to architecture that you took with that building, are those still approaches that you take today? Have your styles evolved? Has your approaches changed to your work?
Well, you can't kind of change it. You are who you are. If you listen to Mozart, it's not Salieri. It's always Mozart. We don't know why. If you look at Vermeer painting, it's not somebody else. It's the blue. It's just Vermeer. If you read a novel, Dostoevsky, it's not Turgenev. It's not Tolstoy. It's a very particular character which is being transmitted to you through the story that is being told. And I think that's really part of not leaping on bandwagons of styles and not what is popular and what is sort of going great, but staying true to yourself. And of course, in that sense, of course, I had to develop my work since the Jewish Museum was my very first building. And I'm so lucky to build so many buildings in so many different places around the world, different programs, different functions, different sites. And of course, each building is unique. It's uniquely memorable. And it's also a work of art, as I see it. It's not a machine. Like Corbusier said, a building is a machine to live in. I've never subscribed to that notion. It's not a machine. It's a place to live. It's a home. And therefore, it has to have really a humanistic character. It has to be related to life and not just to technology.
Can you tell us a little bit about your most recent project, the Portuguese Museum, and,
yes.
and your designs and thoughts on that?
Well, I'm fortunate to be involved in the design of the first Jewish museum in Portugal, which is going to be devoted in Lisbon to the Portuguese Jewish story, which is an amazing story. It's not the Spanish, Inquisition. It's very different because many Spanish Jews escaped during, 15th century to Portugal, but there were, of course, Portuguese Jews living in Portugal for 2,000 years. And what happened during that awful time, 15th century, is that the king said to the Jews, okay, you all want to leave because we're, okay, go ahead, go to the port and you can leave. And then thousands of Jews came to the port with their families. And then the king said, now you cannot leave. I declare you all new Christians, which was a horrifying thing to not allow the Jews to leave, to create a fake identity for Jews. And of course, the Jews had to struggle through this dark period and yet retain their identity. And it's a fascinating story, also a story of hope. I call the museum Tikva, a museum of hope, because it shows, by the way, so many Portuguese people identify with Jews because Jews were so mixed into the society for so many hundreds of years that I think every third Portuguese thinks, well, we are partly Jews as well. So it's a story of the past. It's a story of amazing tradition. It's a story of the future, of resurgence of the Jewish community. And so really, I think it will inspire people from all over the world, not Jews, to see this fascinating city, fascinating culture come alive with the Jewish story. So that's a fantastic project.
Absolutely. We can't wait to see that project come to fruition. I'm wondering if you might share some examples of your work and just to illustrate your architecture and things that we should be looking at or considering when we look at some of your works.
Well, you know, let me give you an example. I'm, for example, working on an affordable housing project in Brooklyn. You know, it's a project of New York State Housing Authority, low cost. And yet my project, which is going to go into construction very soon, shows that even for a very small budget, you can create something that has that sort of dignity of people at the center, creates a social space that is interesting, gives individuality to each window, to each place, doesn't create a sort of box in which people just have to live in because that's a low-cost housing project, but creates something that is beautiful, that is sustainable, that has good materials, and that will make people feel good when they enter it. So yeah, for example, that's the kind of project that I think is very needed in our time, where there's so much income inequality and so much unfairness. And of course, architecture is to address not only, you know, the affluent possibilities, but also regular people, as we see during the pandemic, who were so badly hit, you know, in every possible way. So yes, that's part of my sort of new directions. But I'm of course working on a number of other wonderful projects, museums, for example, museum in Chile, museum of anthropology, in northern Chile, museum, a center of architecture in Poland, in my own city where I was born in Łódź, many.
You just mentioned the Albert Einstein Museum.
Yes, Albert Einstein, yes, Center, which is going to be built at the Hebrew University, which of course, where Albert Einstein was one of the founders of the Hebrew University back in Palestine in the 1920s. He donated all his archives, his theory of relativity, all his papers, his libraries. And how incredible it is that I will have a chance to work on this project at the Hebrew University, right, on the main axis of all the great museums and Knesset in Jerusalem, to create really a homage to one of the greatest sort of, not just greatest scientists and philosophers, but one of the greatest Jews who, fought for Jewish rights. He was, by the way, invited to be the president of Israel. He refused because he said, I'm a scientist. But how fascinating that this building will be now part of the legacy of Jerusalem.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. I want to just get back to music a little, because I've heard you talk about that you still listen to music yourself quite often during the day. Is it a part of your life when you're designing your works? Are you listening to music as you do so? How is it a part of your life?
I think music is much deeper in my life than listening to music. In fact, often when I draw, I don't listen to anything. It's in total silence. But, I approach architecture like music. If you think, what is music? It's from the outside, it seems very abstract, very enigmatic, very geometric, very mathematical, all about vibrations, all about codes, all about emblems, symbolic sounds, and so on. It's exactly like architecture. That's the definition of architecture. So when I make a drawing, a plan for a building, I treat it like a score, like a musical score that, Mendelssohn could have written, or a Bach. It's also just dots and lines and numbers and crescendo marks and multi-level hierarchies for different instruments, just like a piece of architecture. And of course, when you approach architecture in that way, you're not approaching it as just as a sort of a simple one-line idea of translating, a line in a drawing into a wall in space, but you're creating a different resonance so that the plans mean something quite different than just the obvious functionality that is embedded in the code. But look, when you look at a musical score and you're not a musician, you just see a very abstract thing on paper, just like when you look at architecture plan, you just see sort of lines and things, you don't understand what they are, but they are really the same because they involve a participatory experience. You have to be able to interpret it. You have to be able to play it together in a harmony. And often the creator is not on the stage. You know, Mozart is not on the stage, you know, during a performance of the Jupiter Symphony. Bach is not on stage during St. Matthew's Passion. He's just some behind the scenes in the score, in the material, in the object that is not even aware, one is not even aware of. And that's like an architect, because you know you design a building, but it's not about your ego. It's about what is out there, what is performed by thousands of people. Look at Ground Zero; it's thousands of people participate in that project, and yet it's according to something I drew, according to something that is planned in a very, very precise and very disciplined manner. It's not a metaphor; it's a structure. So I see my work really as an extension of music. I see it, and I was just telling you that you know, on German television, I involved myself with a young composer and musician, Benjamin Nuss, who took my drawings, quote, architecture drawings, chamber works that I produced many, many years ago, and he created music, showed that these drawings could be played as a musical score, and he demonstrated it. Now it will be a CD and come out as an object as well. Yes.
That sounds like a fabulous collaboration and something I think that would be greatly enjoyed. I'm wondering about your connection with the Israel Philharmonic. Are there any particular concerts or highlights that stand out to you?
You know, there's so many. You know, Israel Philharmonic is a brilliant. You know, it's not just one more orchestra. You know, started by Huberman, just, you know, doing in Palestine, and it continued developing itself across all the different, you know, stages of formation of the state of Israel, all the, you know, turmoil, and also all the beautiful hopes that Israel represents for all of us. So yes, I've been to so many concerts, both in Tel Aviv and around the world. I even have this, you know, box set of the great recordings of the Israel Philharmonic, which are unsurpassed, with some of the great conductors. So yes, it's been really very much very close to my heart.
Well, we're grateful for your support and to have you so connected. I'm wondering if there's any questions from our listeners.
We have a lot of questions for Daniel. We have a very engaged audience. Thank you everyone who submitted a question during registration. We'll do our best to get through all of them today. First one comes from Fortuna. She asks you, Daniel, you grew up in the amalgamated buildings in the Bronx. How do you remember that time in your life?
It was a wonderful part. You know, we came as immigrants. We were lucky to live in actually the amalgamated housing project was the first building built for working people in the United States. It was built in the 1920s. It no longer exists, but I grew up there. It was a walk-up building, 4 or 5 story walk-up, no elevators, no air conditioning, and yet my memory is of the wonderful community. It was basically a totally Jewish community. I could speak, you know, Polish. I could speak Yiddish on the streets. We were all part of something amazing. All of us were immigrants. All of us had left, you know, dark shores and came to America. And all I can tell you is that a great project does not depend on technology, because it was hot in the summer. We, you know, set out, you know, on the stoops or on the fire escapes, and yet the vividness of life, culture, was at the center. Traditions, people being together. I think that's what makes a great city. It's not just the objective, you know, technical devices we can choose. It's how to bring people that share a sense of something greater than themselves. And that was the amalgamated housing. I had so many friends, so many, and we didn't have televisions. We didn't have, you know, we had like a little radio, but life was about talking with people, taking walks, sitting, you know, and discussing the events of the day. And how lucky that in this housing project, they had every Friday, they had a musical performance. They had a lecture by a professor. They had a discussion. So it was really an unsurpassed privilege to grow up in these housing projects.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel. Helen asks, and here's it's a little bit more of a technical question, but I think it's interesting. What are the qualities you appreciate in the engineers you work with? Well,
I appreciate creativity, and I'm so fortunate to work with amazing engineers who are no longer just, okay, here is a project. Can you make it? Can you have it stand up? Can you make it work? It's engineers who are creative, who offer interesting solutions. Look at the Denver Art Museum, which I built some years ago in Denver. It's probably the longest cantilever in a museum in the world. And yet the engineers came up with ingenious solutions to create a space that has never been built before. And that's one of my interests. My interest is not just to repeat over and over again the same thing, but offer really a new sense of light, a new sense of space. And engineers are, of course, key to doing that.
So M asks, how did your education at Cooper Union influence your architectural style?
Well, I don't think it influenced my style, but I think I had great educators. John Haydock, Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, Michael Graves. They were great architects and intellectuals. And what made my education fantastic is they allowed disobedience. They allowed me to rebel against what they were teaching. They didn't sort of reject the fact that I disagreed. And I'm a rebel. I guess I follow my traditions. My mother, who was always a rebel. My father, who never conformed in a certain way. And so I had an education which tolerated really new ideas and even encouraged them. And how lucky to be in a school which doesn't force you to conform, but allows you the freedom to explore ideas. How lucky I was to have those teachers. And later on, of course, when I went to graduate school, I also had wonderful historians and philosophers who also were able to engage with me in breaking the bounds, going beyond the borders established by many disciplines.
Such a great message. Myron asks, how will COVID affect building design, if at all?
Well, it will affect society at large. Number one, look what happened. We lost social space. We were not able to be together. So the appreciation for what we call public space, social space, has grown now that we understand that this is something precious. It's not to be taken for granted. At the same time, we cannot take for granted what our home is like, because we were in our homes and sometimes inadequately in a small room with 5 people, 10 people. We understood what is necessary. So I think COVID will have forever changed our attitudes, both to home and to space outside. And of course, it will make us think about nature. It will make us think about health. It will make us think about pollution, exploitation of nature. It will make us rethink, our place in the world and also of technology. So I think it's really a massive, massive moment of change.
Dr. Helga asks, how much do you consider acoustics before embarking on a new project?
A lot. I think acoustics is the hidden ghost of most buildings, because often I'm in a building and you speak to a group of 20 people or 15 people and you have to have a microphone because they can't hear you. So acoustic is a key to having a human environment. And by the way, when I created the Jewish Museum, my very first building, I created a large-scale model out of paper, out of sort of thin cardboard, which I tested by playing it, almost like a musical instrument. The different geometries of that Jewish museum permitted to expose different sounds in the building. And I was very acutely aware that in designing the void of the Jewish Museum, I related it to Arnold Schoenberg's incomplete opera, Moses and Aaron, which I studied and listened to because it ends in an aporia where the music just stops and the music cannot go on. And I thought it can go on in emptiness of a building to complete that thought of Schoenberg. What is God saying to us in that discussion with Moses? So yes, I think too many buildings, the acoustics is an afterthought and not the central thought.
So we're getting a lot of really great questions about music and music's influence on your architecture and your designs. Monica asks, what's the main message you want to convey with your work?
That's a great question. You know, let's turn it around. What is the main message of a sonata of Beethoven? You know, what is that message? Well, the music tells us something, but it eludes us to say what it is telling us. We know it's telling us something. It's in its own language, but it's not telling us in anything that we can verbalize. That's exactly architecture. Architecture is telling us something. It's telling us, it's often something very urgent, but it's not telling it to us as a slogan, not in my work. It doesn't tell us in sort of a one-liner what you should feel. It gives us a sense of wonder and of a mystery as well in experiencing it. So yes, the message of architecture and music is very similar. And that's why they are great arts, because they don't depend on systems of communication that are well established. But music appeals to everybody. You can, you know, go anywhere in the world with a piece of music or with a building or a piece of architecture, and everybody can enter it. And everybody can make sense out of it in different ways. They're universal arts.
Going back to the music and music's influence, Barbara asks you, how does music influence your design thought?
Well, let me put it this way. First of all, if one looks at musical instruments, they are gorgeous. They're the most beautiful objects in the world. I mean, just take a look at a violin or hold a violin if you're lucky enough to hold it. Look at the piano, open it. Look at the hammers, look at the mechanism. Look at a flute and how refined. You know, look at the voice, the human voice, you know, which you cannot see with your eyes, but you can test inside of your throat. So music, the instrumentality of music is very similar to architecture. Take a great violin, like a Stradivarius. It's venerated as one of the greatest objects ever made, and it also produces the most beautiful sound, just like a piece of architecture. If it's great, if a piece of architecture is meaningful, it's beautiful to look at, but it's more than that. It produces something. It produces a sense of an atmosphere, or a sense of joy, sense of meaning. So in this way, I think architecture and music are very, very similar, because they are both something like an instrument, but they're also an experience in a deep way.
You know, something we take a lot of pride in at the American Friends of the Israel Philharmonic is that we're always forward thinking, and we're thinking about our future. You know, a lot of that, our partnership with Aspiration is a testament to that. So we have a great question from Mandy that says, what advice would you give the next generation of architecture students who are thinking about architecture as a career?
It's a wonderful question. Difficult to answer. I think my point would be, you know, go on your own path. Don't necessarily go get on the big highway with, you know, all the, you know, stuff traveling on the big highway. Take a path which might be a risky path, because you might not be, quote, succeeding. But if you have integrity, if you are not going to be pulled to the left and to the right, if you stay on the path, it's an adventure. You don't know where you will wind up, what you will do. But I certainly wouldn't look at architecture as something ready-made and fixed. It's something to be discovered. And I think if you have the love for what you're doing, in any field actually, you will definitely succeed, because you will never fail yourself. You will always be true to yourself. Even if for many years, you might be laughed at. For many years, I was considered wasting my time doing my drawings. For many years, people thought, oh my God, he studied architecture, but he's not really an architect at all. He's not built anything. But you have to have patience, and you have to have a belief in something bigger than yourself. And you have to have the courage to stray into the desert. Look, Moses was for 40 years in the desert. He never even saw the promised land. He only saw it, he never entered it. And, in that great conversation, when Moses stands next to God, God is speaking, and he said, how should I call you? And God says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. It's often translated, I am who I am, but in Hebrew, actually, Ehyeh asher ehyeh means I will be who I will be. So that's the key. The key is the future. You will be what you will be.
A second part to this question that Mandy asks is, if you could partner with an architect who is no longer alive on a project, who would it be?
Oh my God, that's the most impossible question to answer. There's so many geniuses, across time. So many incredible architects. I was just in Athens, and I was, walking on the grounds of the Parthenon, and thinking how incredible this temple, which was not even a religious symbol, it was really a civic idea, standing on the Acropolis, which looks so, pure, and yet not a single column is at right angle to the ground. The base is curving. All the columns are leaning inwards. Our eyes are being fooled by the ingenious mastery of proportions and geometries to make it all look perfect. So yes, there were so many geniuses. Actually, when I was at the Parthenon, I thought I'd like to work with Ictinus and Callicrates.
I just want to thank everyone who's asking a question in the chat. If we're in the last 10 minutes here, but if you have one, try and get it in. We will ask Daniel live on the air. Lynn asks, which of your variety of Jewish-related projects have touched your soul the most?
Well, I'm so lucky. I've built so many very interesting projects that have at the core Jewish principles, Jewish ideas. And what I've introduced is something that has never been done, which is the divinity of Hebrew letters. Most architecture that was produced for synagogues, for example, in the 19th century and earlier, was not produced really by Jewish people. There are Protestants who created great, synagogues and so on. But I thought to myself, today, what can we do? How can we express something eternal in architecture? And to me, the eternity of architecture, in the sense of what it makes it Jewish, is the Hebrew letter. The Hebrew letter, because we are Jews, because we can read Hebrew. We understand that the letters are not just symbols like Greek letters or Roman letters, that they themselves have a divine character because they have persisted in the story which they themselves communicate. So, for example, at San Francisco Contemporary Jewish Museum, I introduced a museum based on Chai, Chet and Yud, which are, of course, just letters, but they are much more than letters. They are life itself. And of course, I did not introduce them just as graphic elements, but I introduced them as an enveloping system of emblematic and spatial relationships. So yes, I think that's part of how I work. In fact, in the memorial in Amsterdam, which will open in September, the first Holocaust memorial dedicated to Dutch Jews, more than 100,000 who, of course, perished in the Shoah. And this memorial will have every name, not every, more than 110,000 names, so there are more that will come, made, as a kind of foundation on which Lizkor, to remember, is featured as a reflective sort of sense of light that brings the city back into this foundation of what you no longer see in Amsterdam and in Holland. So yes, I think Hebrew letters, my love for Hebrew letters and for writing Hebrew letters and for meditating about what they are, really what they are. Why we are among the most ancient people who can still create a history that is always contemporary, that isn't back in the past, that is always in the future. Yeah.
Helen asks another great question, and she says, what new trends are you most excited about in architecture? And she cites glass, timber, and carbon absorption as possible new advances in the field.
Well, that's right. She's correct. We've got many new advances. We have many new materials. We have many new technologies that are coming to online, so to speak. And we have many ways to create architecture, which are also new technologically. So there is, the word sustainability really contains a plethora of strategies to create a better environment. But to me, what underpins sustainability is really memory, because only what is truly memorable can be sustained. Even in fragments and ruins, what is memorable is upheld as a future. And so to me, one of the lessons of sustainability in technology is to go to the deep roots of architecture, to be radical, and that's called the roots, and to touch upon memory, which is something not like a metaphor. It's not a symbol. It's not something you can buy in a book. It's not something you can get from somewhere. It's something that is just there, which you have to discover in some way. Nobody knows exactly how to discover it. But if you're lucky to, by accident or by an act of revelation, discover a memory, then you really create something sustainable. And so I agree with this question that there are many new ways. And of course, we are excited by what is coming technologically. But I always think, what is the progress in the human soul? Are we making progress in kindness, which apparently is the only thing which is not evolutionary? Everything else is evolution, even love. But kindness, to be kind, is not necessary. And yet, how is it that people still can, some, retain kindness in a world threatened by so much hatred?
That's really a perfect segue to the next question, which Alva asks in our chat box here. She says, you will be designing the new Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. What influenced your decision to accept this project after the heartbreaking tragedy that occurred there?
Well, it didn't take me a second to want to be involved in it. Look, I'm an immigrant to America. When we came to America, America was the promised land. There was no anti-Semitism. We thought, here Jews, like in Israel, were free. We were not under threat. And yet, when we read the headlines today, when we see the aftermath of the terrible war that just happened in Israel, when we see the anti-Semitic attacks on Jews, we have to respond to it. We cannot just sit back and say, let's just rebuild the synagogue, let's just rebuild the grounds, let's just fix everything. We have to create something that brings people back together across all borders, across all divisions, and to show that the essence of architecture is democracy. That if we cannot live with each other, if we cannot appreciate each other's differences, we will all fail. And of course, Jewish traditions call for such a space. And I think the Tree of Life Synagogue will be a very good example of a synagogue and a place of education, a place of memory, a place of being together, a place of worship, a place of future, a place of hope, to create a sense that there's something positive that we have to follow. We cannot just fall, into the gutter of some of the contemporary developments we see around us. So yeah, that's something very inspiring, very difficult, not easy, but something very challenging and meaningful to me.
And you touched a lot upon the next question in your answer there. So you might not have a new answer for this one, but Anita asks, what is the message you want to convey with your design of the Tree of Life memorial renovation project?
Well, I think one of the things you have to be very clear is the affirmation of life. It's the affirmation of life that with all the darkness and all the shadows that fall, we affirm life. We affirm the beauty of life, the freedom of life. Freedom itself is at the core. I mean, look for how many generations the Jews have celebrated Pesach, you know, the holiday of freedom, to leave bondage, to leave the shackles, to be free. So yes, that's, I think, at the center also of the response. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean not to live in a divided society, to be living under a dictatorship, under false leaders, under false messiahs? What does it mean to live in freedom with others? That's really the question of architecture, because it's creation of the space, which has to be a space which is safe, which is intersubjective, which is pluralistic, which offers differences to everybody, which is inviting. I think that's really the affirmation of life.
And as a follow-up to this, Anita asks a beautiful question, and she says, I live in Ottawa, Canada, and I want to make a donation to help fund this Tree of Life Synagogue and Memorial Project. Is there a fund that's been created? And if so, where might I find that? I'm
probably the wrong person to ask, but you probably have, as the Tree of Life Synagogue itself. I don't have the exact, email address, but I'm sure there is such a structure set up, because of course we have to gather funds, in order to build something meaningful. It's always a challenge. So yes, please do not give this up because of my lack of answer, but please pursue it a little further, or email me and I will put you in touch with the right people.
And I think that we're going to close out on this question, and if we might have chance for one more, but Jonathan asks, do you remember that a single aha moment when you decided to become an architect, and if so, when and what was that?
That's a difficult question. It's probably not true. I don't think I had an aha moment. I think there was no such moment. It was just a stream, like being in on a wave that brings you upwards, and suddenly you realize you see the horizon in a different way than when you were in the water. And all the things that sort of made me interested in the things that I was interested in, whether it was calculus, whether it was, the philosophy of, Spinoza, the writing of, Lermontov, the poetry, the things I was seeing, the beauty of, paintings I would go, every day to the museum to look at. Somehow all of it suddenly made me realize it's really all architecture. And I can't say that there was a single moment, but it was the kind of force of life that lifted me to this revelation. Because yeah, it is a revelation that architecture is a wonder.
Thank you, Daniel, for giving so much time to answer so many of our audience's questions. I know some of you had some more questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get to get them answered by Daniel today, but we really appreciate you asking and being here with us. I'm going to throw it back to Trisha, because I'm going to close out the question and answer portion of this conversation.
I could sit and talk to Daniel for another hour. I want to thank you for your time. You are engaging and inspirational, a genuine friend to the Israel Philharmonic, and we are so grateful for your time today and all of your support always. So thank you. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Trisha. Thank you, and thanks for everyone who participated. I hope I meet you all individually and not just virtually, but in reality. Thank you so much. It's always an honor to be part of something for the Israel Philharmonic. So I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.